or stands watch above. Disposal of the dirt is accomplished by pushing the dirt through the sump directly onto the toilets above and into the huge sewage pit beyond. Once a week, Polish farmer Franciszek Lewandowski arrives at the camp and pumps the sewage out for use on his farm. Yet Lewandowski has begun to notice more and more dirt in the wastewater. Before he has a chance to complain to the Nazi guards, though, another prisoner, Józef Birks, a young Czechoslovakian, informs Lewandowski of the escape plan. The Polish farmer is no fan of the Nazis, especially after their invasion and occupation of his home, and keeps the plan a secret, doing his part to aid the would-be escapees by dutifully carting away the soil. As the digging team finishes its work for the day, the third team enters the tunnel and begins the job of shoring up the tunnel walls and ceiling. The tunneling work, carried out with nothing more than cut-out aluminum cans, is dangerous work, and the tunnel is under constant threat of collapse. Each day that the tunnel extends further and deeper, the men require just a little bit more courage to enter the dark tunnel, not knowing if that's the day the tunnel will collapse and trap them with little or no hope of rescue. It's the job of the third team then to enter and shore up the sides and ceiling as best they can, using wooden boards taken from their barracks and even the bed frames themselves. The boards make for a rudimentary shoring but help add a little bit of safety to the entire endeavor as they shore up the freshly dug length of tunnel. The men also extend the air pipe, which brings in oxygen to the tunneling crew. They use powdered milk cans for the job, cutting them so that they fit end to end. The air they pump is from the latrine itself and fetid with the stench of human waste, but it brings life-saving oxygen as the men dig deeper and further into the earth. To expedite the process of digging, the men have developed an ingenious system to move freshly dug earth to the latrine sump for disposal. 2 lengths of rope extends down the tunnel, and at one end is an empty sack. The diggers fill the sack with dirt and then give the rope a sharp tug, which causes the man at the halfway point to begin hauling on the rope to bring the dirt out of the tunnel. Once it reaches the midway point, that man attaches it to the second rope, whose end he has with him, and then gives that rope a sharp tug. The men at the entrance then drag the sack from the halfway point all the way to the entrance of the tunnel, where the dirt is emptied into the latrine sump. The system is rudimentary and nowhere as near sophisticated as the homemade railroad tracks and trolleys that the men at the Stalag Luft 3 prison complex would use to escape and serve as inspiration for the film The Great Escape. Yet the process saves countless hours of labor, as it takes half an hour to squeeze down the 2-foot by 2-foot tunnel each day. In early March of 1943, the team digging at the end of the tunnel began to dig directly upwards. By their calculations, they dug several hundred feet past the perimeter fencing, a task which required them to not just dig out from their starting point, but down into the rocky soil to a depth of over a dozen feet, in order to avoid the seismic sensors that the Germans have installed to detect digging. Once well out of the fence, the tunnel begins to angle upwards again, and now the men are digging straight up. One of them takes a long stick and pushes it into the ceiling above, feeling resistance for 2 feet before the stick gives way to the top side. The tunnel is finished, and to avoid detection, the last 2 feet of the tunnel will be dug up on the day of their escape. Now the men prepare for their breakout. While the dig teams were working for weeks on the tunnel, Birsk, the young Czech, has been helping secure fake papers for the escapees. To do this, he managed to talk his way into being part of a detail that's taken every week under guard to a produce store in town. There, the prisoner detail buys a few luxuries for the POWs, such as chocolate, cigarettes, and the sorts. They pay for this from the meager wages paid to them by the German government under its obligations to pay POWs for their labor via the Geneva Convention. At the store, a young Polish girl, Stefania Maludzenska, works behind the counter, and it isn't long before she's swooning at Birk's charms. She's been helping to smuggle letters to Birk's family members for months, but now the escapees need her help in far more dangerous work. Stefania has friends who work at town hall, and she has them steal official German forms that will serve as a template for the forged identity papers needed by the escapees. Their identity papers will ID the escapees as Polish citizens after their escape, allowing them to bypass security checkpoints and hide their identities as POWs. Yet, for the papers to look legitimate, there's one more thing that's needed: a photograph of each of the escapees to adorn their fake papers. To get these photographs, Stefania takes the biggest risk of her life and helps secure a small camera and film from a Polish laborer who used to be a teacher before the German invasion. Now he's forced to do hard labor and work rebuilding the same roads the Germans themselves bombed in the invasion. And helping the prisoners escape will be his small measure serve revenge against the Nazis. The camera and the film is smuggled into camp via a 17-year-old boy who routinely brings a shipment of the prisoners' daily allowance of bread, all hidden safely amongst the loaves. After the prisoners take their photos, the film is then smuggled out through the same young teenage boy who develops the photos himself in a makeshift photo lab inside his parents' tiny apartment. All of these brave Polish civilians assisting the escapees are taking huge risks, and discovery of their involvement would certainly lead to a quick execution. The date for the breakout is set to be March 5th, as those amongst the prisoners with meteorological knowledge estimate that this will be the next moonless night. In order to have the best chance of escape, the men must move under the cover of deepest darkness, and with no moon in the sky, they stand a good chance of being unseen by the perimeter sentries. The men decide that immediately after 5 p.m. roll call, a group of them will head straight to the tunnel and wall themselves in until after lockup at 9 p.m., when the rest of the group will sneak out of their bunks and make their way to the tunnel. A mathematician amongst them calculates that the tunnel will be able to support up to 33 men for 6 hours before the oxygen runs out and the men asphyxiate. The figures and the math are both rough, but it's the best the men have to go on. At 5 p.m. on March 5th, the guards line up the POWs and conduct their daily count. Satisfied that all men are accounted for, they're left alone for recreation time. 800 men move to the recreation ground where a rugby match has been staged in order to help cover the escape attempt. The men plotting their escape conceal clean clothes under their coats, their pockets stuffed with a concoction termed the mixture, a high-energy food made by the prisoners. In each of their pockets are also their identification papers, a map of the region, and a homemade compass. Overhead, gray clouds build up and cold gusts of wind force the German guards to seek what shelter they can inside their guard towers. The men head to the latrine in pairs, and once inside, ditch their overcoats and make their way into the filth below. As the night goes on, the men are relieved to discover that the calculations for oxygen supply were correct. And at last, 9 p.m. rolls around, along with the final group to enter the escape tunnel. The men break through the last 2 feet of dirt at the end of the tunnel and crawl out into freedom. Grateful to leave the smelly, stinking tunnel behind at last, the men break up into groups and head in different directions so as not to draw attention to themselves, posing as travelers. Unfortunately, within the end of the week, all 36 escapees would be recaptured by the Germans, with many sent off to new prison camps. Though the escape ultimately failed, it proved to be one of the most daring and smelliest escapes of World War II, inspiring many heroic attempts by other Allied soldiers throughout the rest of the conflict. Think you could have stomached digging through a giant sewer to get to safety? Let us know in the comments, and as always, if you enjoy World War II was a time of terror that brought out the worst in many. Yet even in the darkest, most desperate times, people joined together to fight against the wicked in positions of authority, even when the consequence they would face was often certain death. Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wetzler are two such men who fought for what was right, even when all of the odds were stacked against them. They wanted to save others from execution, but first, they'd have to escape from the Nazis' camp they were imprisoned in. They knew that if they were caught, they'd be executed, because they were trying to escape from a Nazi death camp. Today, you can say the word Auschwitz and pretty much everyone will know exactly what you're talking about. The concentration camp in Europe, the biggest of those used by Hitler and the Nazis during World War II, a sight of unspeakable horror. The unsuspecting Jewish population from surrounding areas was systematically brought to Auschwitz in the cattle cars of trains. Here in the death camp, they were murdered in gas chambers by the thousands upon thousands. As the Nazis expanded their territory over the war, so too did the concentration camp's operation to accommodate the further influx of victims. It's estimated that in 1944, up to 12,000 Jewish people were killed at Auschwitz every day. These were men, women, and children, husbands and wives and sons and daughters, all surrounded by barbed wire and Nazi guards, and killed mercilessly and without hesitation. Those who made a run for it but failed were publicly executed. Many people entered Auschwitz. Few would leave alive. What's hard to grasp now is that even as late as 1944, many of the details of what went on in the concentration camps weren't well or widely known by the outside world. In fact, massacres carried out in concentration camps were kept secret from almost everyone except those "He was such a nice man, a pillar of the community," said so many people who knew and trusted the man who became known as Dr. Death. Over decades, this serial killer visited the homes of his patients, and when he left, those patients were perhaps too often no longer breathing. But how chronic was his compulsion to kill? At first, it was thought he'd murdered a handful of people, and then it was scores of his victims, with the final number still being disputed. What we do know is that Mr. Shipman could have been the most prolific serial killer of all time. Harold Shipman was known to a lot of people. He was a family doctor in a small community, an agent of help, and over 2 decades he became a man whose face most people recognized in the street. This bespectacled, tweed-wearing doctor that looked perhaps what you'd imagine a small-town British doctor to look like was indeed a pillar of the community. But to say he had a dark secret would be the understatement of the century, because Harold Shipman, aka the Angel of Death, wasn't just Britain's most prolific killer, but he's up there with the most murderous criminals the world has ever seen. He was born on the 14th of January 1946 with the full name Harold Frederick Shipman. To his friends, patients, and colleagues, he was simply known as Fred or Freddy. As is almost always the case with the people we feature in this series of shows, if we want to try and understand how someone became a killer, we might look to traumas in childhood. What went wrong? For young Freddy, that was the death of his mother when he was 17. His friends in interviews years later said that young Fred didn't talk much about his mother's fight with lung cancer, and how he watched when the local doctor used to come around to his house and relieve her pain with morphine. But it's thought young Fred was a very devoted son. His mother had gone to great pains to make sure her working-class boy brought up on a council estate, that's like the projects for our American viewers, got into grammar school. Again, for American viewers, this is a school kids had to pass exams to get into, populated perhaps with few poor kids. But Shipman tried in earnest to please his mother, and his mother became very proud of her son. We might also add that some bios said she was domineering and overbearing, sometimes a recipe for disaster. It said she pushed him too hard, and in turn he became isolated from other kids. His mother would foster in him a sense of superiority, but this would become a lifelong problem for Shipman, who perhaps could never get his mother out of his head. Still perhaps trying to please his mother, and with her painful, long drawn-out death on his mind, Fred was determined to become a doctor. He would dedicate his life to other people's pain. But as we will see, his method of treatment we might perhaps say was overboard, a tad too total. Shipman studied at Leeds University Medical School in the north of England and later took on internships at hospitals. He was on his way to becoming a doctor and a step closer to becoming a serial killer. During this time though, even though it said he was a loner, he would meet his future wife. He was 19 and she was 17 when she became pregnant with their first child. They would have 4 kids in total. In 1974, he would get his first job as a GP or general practitioner. That's basically your run-of-the-mill family doctor. The clinic where he worked was located in a small town called Todmorden in West Yorkshire, which on the outside looks like a beautiful rural town, nestled between valleys, what a poet might have called England's green and pleasant land. But looks can be deceiving, because even though Shipman might have looked like he was living the perfect rural life, he was at that time forging prescriptions of the opioid called pethidine. Yep, he was hooked on a kind of prescription heroin. He was caught and fined, but after some rehab, he was back in business. In 1977, he began working in another small community, this time on the other side of those valleys in a place called Hyde, just outside Manchester. Okay, so we should tell you now that we don't exactly know when Dr. Shipman consummated his curse and became Dr. Death. It's generally thought that he didn't waste much time and was killing when starting out in Todmorden. How many he killed is a number that changes by the source, but it was a lot. Hundreds. But how many hundreds? We still do not know. This might make him the worst serial killer in history, but getting the exact body count is not always easy. There have been a couple of deranged Colombians that might have a stake in the most kills count, and as historians point out, data from some countries might be unreliable. Then you also have some depraved rich Europeans from times past who also took great pleasure in murdering scores of peasants for their amusement. So he's now working in this small Lancashire town. He'll stay there for around 2 decades, and Mr. Shipman, as we have said, will become what's called a pillar of the community. In fact, one of the senior doctors who worked with him said that Shipman would take on a massive workload, and his patients for the most part adored him. He was said to be the most popular doctor at the medical center. What could possibly go wrong? The answer to that is his patients seemed to kick the bucket a lot, perhaps before their time was up. Psychologists have said that he might have murdered some of his patients because of the power it gave him. He became God, and the memory of his dying mother was never far away. But it's said he also murdered when there was money in it for him. In one case, someone's will. He also obtained large amounts of morphine by saying he needed it for patients that sometimes didn't actually need it. According to the Guardian newspaper, most of his victims were old women. That report says his first victim was a 71-year-old woman who Shipman got rid of in 1975. It was the eve of her birthday, too. His youngest victim was a 41-year-old man and his eldest a 93-year-old woman. Killing became easier for him when he left that medical center and started his own practice in the same town. You might well be thinking, how come no one noticed that there was this doctor in town that if you saw, there was a good chance your days were numbered? Didn't anyone say, wait a minute, my mom was alright on Friday and on Saturday she was found slumped over in her chair. And that's what happened to so-and-so's mother. And the other woman too. Well, apparently no one could see past the nice man in a tweed jacket. It wasn't until 1998 that the local undertakers in the town of Hyde started saying that it seemed like a lot of bodies were coming from him. Indeed, it was soon found out that his death rate was 10 times higher than other doctors. On top of that, many of those that died did so in the same position, like a drug addict that's overdone it. The mostly old women were sat upright or slumped on a sofa, and they were fully clothed. The Guardian writes that the police investigation in '98 was a shamble, stating that police didn't check inconsistencies of his medical notes with the deaths of his patients. The police investigation failed to carry out even the most basic checks, including whether Shipman had a criminal record, wrote the Guardian. But some members of the local community were onto him. Even a taxi driver came forward and said Shipman was killing off perfectly healthy individuals. Then, also in 1998, a former mayoress who had a bit of cash stashed away died in Shipman's care. She left most of this money to Shipman, but the daughter wasn't having any of that. She ordered the body be exhumed, and Shipman was subsequently charged with his first murder. The coroner, of course, ruled that the woman had died of a morphine overdose. What followed you could perhaps call an exhumation sweep. Lo and behold, the notes Shipman had written didn't match what had actually happened. Those bodies showed that morphine toxicity had turned off the life that had once been inside them. The notes also showed that Shipman had often made up a bunch of ailments patients never had, and he'd done that often right before they died. It was also found out that in some cases he told the relatives of the deceased that before the old bean had passed, he'd called for an ambulance, but phone records showed that he lied about that. The delectable doctor was finally becoming Dr. Death. Police and people of the town just couldn't believe what had been happening right under their eyes. It turned out that in just an 18-month period, on one street alone, 6 of Shipman's patients had died. In front of him after he'd gone around and done his house visit. It was also found out that in the space of 1 month, 8 of his female patients had died in mysterious circumstances. It said in court he was still possessed with that air of superiority his mother had helped create. He lied, changed his stories, was apparently arrogant and unhelpful, and denied everything, even though there was so much evidence. In fact, in one documentary, Shipman's former cellmate explains that he never admitted to the crimes. That cellmate had tried to hang himself at one point, and it was Shipman that revived him. He took lives, but leaving a dying man hanging in his cell was not his MO. Despite this act of kindness, investigators said he tried to belittle police and acted domineering in interviews. He was treating this as some sort of game. a competition pitting what he considered to be his superior intellect, to those of the officers who were interviewing him. One of those investigators told the BBC, in 2000, he was convicted of 15 counts of murder and handed a life sentence. The town of Hyde was in shock, but the story would soon turn even more grim. A lot of people, of course, started wondering if their aunt, grand, uncle, or cousin had actually just passed away on the sofa in their sleep, or whether the now not-so-nice doctor had given them his most potent life-ending cocktail, the Shipman Sofa Special. An audit followed which produced a 2,000-page report. It was revealed that over the 24 years Shipman had been taking care of people, 500 of those people had died. That report concluded that of those people he had killed 218. Today, it's still thought that the number could be as high as 250. This is the number given in the sixth and final investigation and report. It was said that Shipman was addicted to killing, and his last victim would be himself. On the 13th of January 2004, he was found hanging in his cell. He'd used his bed sheets. The prison was criticized for allowing this to happen, but an investigation ruled the suicide could not have been predicted or prevented. Shipman's wife and children always said they knew nothing about his dark side, but they, for the most part, avoided talking openly to the media. So, what do you think about this man? Does his high body count make him even more evil than a sadistic killer, or do you think his crimes were less We have summarized to you in our Worst Punishment series despicable things men have done to each other in the name of justice, often a very disconcerting kind of justice. Many of the punishments we've discussed were used at different times in history and in different countries, with each purveyor of pain putting its own spin on the punishment. The Chinese, for instance, flayed the flesh of an enemy's back in ancient times, but might have just flayed a person's face as a stern telling off. While a lèse-majesté crime in 14th century Europe could have gotten you flayed from head to toe, then castrated, and then beheaded for good measure. Yes, these shows might be hard to stomach, but we think the barbarity of the past shouldn't be ignored. And so we'll start this series with a torture that's often said to be the worst kind of torture that has ever existed in recorded history. We say that, but it's hardly easy to invoke the superlative when you have people getting their skin peeled off after being boiled in a pot. Maybe burning at the stake was better than modern white torture. At least it was over with quickly. So we won't say what's the worst and certainly won't attempt to tell you what was the best, but we'll start with rat torture only because it's so darn outlandish. With this kind of official devilment, we have to separate the myth from the truth, or at least try and back up the truth with substantial facts. What we can say with assuredness is that one kind of rat torture was perhaps the incidental kind of punishment. That's because you can find in the Tower of London something called the Dungeon of the Rats. Writers in the Elizabethan period said what would happen is the prisoners would be kept in the dungeon, and when the River Thames rolled in, the water would spill into the cell. Prisoners were less than fond of this time, as the water would bring rats with it, and those rats would occasionally gnaw on the prisoner's flesh. We assume the guards knew this was happening. Maybe this was better than being locked into a tiny cell called Little Ease, because the prisoners in this place had to stay for a long time, crouched in a painful position. It could have been worse. After a stint with the rats, you might have gotten sent to the rack. We're told in the 17th century, though, those bloodthirsty English elites cleaned up their act a little bit. Okay, now it gets even worse. We'll talk about the old
more like Hurricane Tortilla. My food is coming!
It's me, Jesse, and Aubrey. If they test me, they're sorry. Riders up like a Harley and pull up in for robbery.
You're a wizard, Harry. I'm what? A wizard.
It's me, Jesse, and Aubrey.
What did you do? I shaved my eyebrows. Why did you do that? I don't know.
Happy Christmas. It's Christmas. Merry Crisis. Merry Chrysler.
My dad has a gold tooth. Wow, gold tooth? My dad has a gold tooth. Look, my dad has diabetes. LeBron James, LeBron James, LeBron James, LeBron James, LeBron James.
You are my dad. You're my dad. Boogie, boogie, boogie.
Release all the sounds that are trapped in your mind. Sir, are you okay?
I'm a little messed up.
Look at this graph!
You guys say Colorado!
3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Get it together, sweetie. We have a show this weekend.
But the prophecy is true.
If your name is Junior and you're really handsome, come on, raise your hand.
Hi, I'm Renata Bliss, and I'm your freestyle dance teacher.
And how much you pay for that taco?
Hey, yo, you know this, boy. He's got his free taco.
Well, it's been a great day today. Can't wait for more.
Pop it. Twist it. Pull it.
I think I know more about American football than you do.
You'll never listen to any American girl studies.
Mix it all together and you know that it's the best of both worlds.
The name game. Judy, Judy, Judy for booty, banana, banana for booty.
Welcome to physics.
Holy moly!
What will you learn? That your actions have consequences!
Jello, more like hello.
You know what? I love myself. Even though I look like a burnt chicken nugget, I still love myself.
No off-topic questions. Because I don't want to. No, permission denied. That's an off-topic questions. Next, you have been stopped.
You know, it's huge. You want to start playing your best baseball towards the end of May.
Is that a dog in a car? Hey! Ari, where'd you learn to drive? What?
Hi, and this is my impression of when Shakira goes to wash her hands but the water's too hot. Thank you.
Otis. Man down.
What is love? Baby, don't hurt me.
Da 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 da.
What is going on here?
If I had a penny for every time I wasn't cool, I'd have no pennies.
Diabetes.
Ryan!
Is that really a pumpkin?
No!
Accept yourself. Love yourself. Accept yourself.
Let me hop out the for somebody there.
Shut the up.
Let her go!
That's all she really does, ever since she bought that $5 kazoo. That's all she really does.
Our Earth is warming up and our oceans are rising. Extreme weather is wrecking millions of lives.
From California to the Amazon, our forests are burning. We are in a climate emergency.
We cannot let this happen on our watch. Up to 1 million species are becoming extinct because of mankind's actions, and time is running out.
History shows us that when enough people rise up and demand
Lucifer is lonely. Standing there, killing time. Can't commit to anything but a crime. Leaders on vacation, an open invitation. Animals, evidence. Pearly gates look more like a picket fence. Once you get inside them, got friends but can't invite them. Hills burn in California. My turn to ignore ya. Don't say I didn't warn ya. All the good girls go to hell, 'cause even God herself has enemies. And once the water starts to rise and heaven's out of sight, she'll want the devil on her team. My Lucifer is lonely.
People rise up and demand change.
That's all she really does, ever since she bought that $5 kazoo.
What are those? They are my Crocs.
I've been in the kitchen, whipping. I've been chefing.
Back at it again at Krispy Kreme.
Pronouns incorrectly. Capacity farm
Cam Peter.
Monkey next. Beaver age. Shades and copies.
And they were roommates.
Oh my god, they were roommates.
Do I look like... Do I look...
Hey, how much money do you have? Like 69 cents.
You know what that means?
I don't have enough money for chicken nugget.
I wanted to be a cowboy, baby. I wanted to be a cowboy, baby.
I want a church girl that go to church.
What are you?
I'm a chicken nugget.
Get the up! I get no sleep cause of y'all. Y'all not gonna get no sleep cause of me. I get no sleep cause of y'all. Y'all not gonna get no sleep cause of me. I get no sleep cause of y'all.
Country boy, I love you.
Cinderella, why do you want to go to the ball? 'Cause stepmother, ball is life.
Cheddar, jalapeno, and sour cream and onion. The spicy nacho stack.
I wish I could stack Pringles, but I don't have hands or a mouth to...
Cool, play Funky Town.
There's a Pringle stack for everyone, sort of.
Bring here chicken water. How do I do this? How do I pull this out without making the balls fall? Well, I have a solution.
Pickles are destroying my life.
Cabbage, cabbage, cabbage. Lettuce, lettuce, lettuce!
Everybody clap your hands.
Please clap.
Hey, how you doing? Well, I'm doing just fine. I lied, I'm dying inside.
Hey, kids, kids! Patricia! Honey, can you be quiet? I'm just trying to do something.
What will you learn? What will you learn? That your actions have consequences.
I'm semi automatic. Money add and multiply. I call it math for mathematics.
Croissant.
I'm hungry! Don't you eat any of my food!
Here comes that boy.
Just kidding, it's me, Hillary.
Iridocyclitis. IRIDO-cyclitis.
Give me that coffee. Give me that coffee. Give me that coffee.
No. Before you open up the dirty window, the sun illuminates.
Do you know the way? Do you know the way? It doesn't do the way. Do you know the way? You gotta know the way.
Ooh.